One. Blast off.
I'm Pete Wehner. I'm a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center.
Hi, I'm Steve Waldman. I'm the editor of Beliefnet.com and author of the book Founding Faith.
Well, it's good to be with you, Steve. I'm eager for the conversation. I read through the book and like it a great deal. This will be more of a conversation than a debate, I suspect. But maybe as a starting point, you could summarize the book, the main points of it, and then I'd be curious if there's anything that you learned in writing the book and researching the book that was contrary to your thesis, some of your premises going in. So why don't we start that way?
Thank you very much, first of all. I started to get into this book because I kept getting peppered with emails from different advocacy groups quoting one founding father or another to prove just about anything. And you can find a founding father's quote to prove whatever you want. And I just got curious about how the culture wars had distorted our sense of what really happened. It starts with a premise that I have, that I think you probably do as well, that religious freedom is one of America's greatest achievements, so I wanted to find out the real story of what actually happened. If I had to summarize the thesis in a sentence, it's that the country was not founded as a Christian nation, nor was it founded as a secular nation, but it was founded to embrace religious liberty, by which they meant promoting religion by leaving it alone. So it was very much, the founders did believe that religion was a crucial part of the flourishing of the republic, that you couldn't have a republican form of government without a virtuous citizenry, and you needed religion for that. But where they broke from their fathers and forefathers was, up until that point, of course, they believed that if you wanted to encourage religion, the thing to do was to have the state get in there and encourage religion through state religions or having tax dollars pay for ministers' salaries or churches. And so they did do an abrupt change off of that. In terms of the thing that surprised me most, there was a lot that surprised me as I got into this. I think the main one was the role of the 18th century evangelicals. As you know better than I, evangelicals are often cast, particularly by mainstream media, as kind of closed-minded ayatollahs that are all about, squelching freedom. And in this period, we really wouldn't have religious freedom if it wasn't for the 18th century evangelicals. So I think for liberals, there's a little bit of a surprising message that the evangelicals are somewhat the heroes of this book. For conservatives, there's a surprise too, though, which is that the evangelicals were often the greatest advocates of separation of church and state.
Yeah, and I think you're right that it was actually the evangelicals who opposed religion and politics intermingling, and I want to circle back to that. But what was it that the evangelicals of the 18th century saw that some evangelicals of the 21st century and the late 20th century didn't see?
Well, to some extent, of course, they were just close to persecution. So they were horribly persecuted themselves, and in an accident of history that turned out to be very important, the Baptists of Virginia, of Northern Virginia, the same part of Northern Virginia that gave us Jefferson, Madison, George Mason, George Washington, Patrick Henry, there was a huge wave of persecution of Baptists right at that period. So to some extent, they were just they saw very vividly what happens when state power is aligned with one particular religion. But it went beyond that, because what really impressed me was that there was a very subtle theology to it. First of all, they just felt it was an inappropriate, it wasn't biblical. That Jesus and Christianity had talked about a separation of realms, render unto Caesar. And more importantly, and the part that I think really gets missed, is that they came to have a view that even well-meaning help would end up hurting. And that is often lost. And they walked through how it would happen. They basically, it was a very modern, really, analysis. They said, well, yeah, you could have, it may start off helping, but you have to establish a bureaucracy to collect the taxes, and then you have to, when they give out the tax dollars, you'll have to have someone's going to have to decide which are the worthy religions, what counts as a religion, what doesn't count as a religion. Before long, you'll have regulation, and they even went to the point, they had a very free market sensibility, where they thought that if you helped religion, the quality of religion would go down. And that they really loved the idea that if it was a voluntary private system, that the market, in effect, would elevate good preaching. You know, the preachers that were really serving a purpose would be supported by the congregants, and if they were supported by government, the quality of the preaching would go down.
That is interesting. Cream rises to the top, and they were free marketers, so good for them. I guess one question on a clarification on the religious right today. Although my own view is that the religious right, as understood in the Falwell and Robertson model, and even to some extent the James Dobson model, is largely obsolete, and we're a good ways past that, and there have been pretty significant changes within the evangelical world, which you follow quite closely, Beliefnet and so forth. But to be fair to the religious right, and I've had my own qualms with them over the years and written about it, and I'm happy to go into why. They really haven't been advocates of state power aligning with one religion, have they? What is your sense of what the grievances are of the religious right, and what, on a principle level, is it that you object to? Because I don't think anybody is saying, that we should endorse the Baptist faith and exclude Catholics and use the power of government to arbitrate those. So I want to be fair to what the religious right's views are.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, no one is advocating going back to state control or persecution the way they had it then. And in fact, I actually end up siding with the religious right, or at least with religious conservatives, on a lot of the constitutional judgments about what is actually permissible. Mm-hmm. I tend to come out as saying there's lots of stuff that may be constitutionally permissible that we shouldn't do anyway. Right. Just because it's permissible doesn't mean it's a good idea. I think that I would actually divide the religious right up into two subgroups. There's a real literature that's developed in the last decade that argues affirmatively that separation of church and state is a myth, that it just was made up by 20th century courts. I mean, in my book, I list a half a dozen books that actually have the title "Myth of Separation of Church and State" in the title. And I don't agree with that. I think that the separation of church and state, there were disagreements among the founders. There's loads of disagreements about how to interpret it and what it means in practical terms. But I don't think that the idea that this doctrine of separation of church and state was a myth. I don't agree with that. Where I am more likely to agree with them and feel like they've been somewhat caricatured is in the particulars of what they feel passionately about, things like prayer in school and faith-based initiative and Ten Commandments in the courtroom. I think both sides have to admit something on this, which is that there are good arguments on both sides, but the founders themselves, who wrote the Constitution, disagreed with each other about what this meant. So there is real room for disagreement, and so I don't think that. I tend to come out more on the Madison side of things, which is, and his view at the end of the day was, if you have a gray area, you should err on the side of separation. Mm-hmm. Not because he thought, the religious people are going to destroy the political system. Jefferson sort of thought that. Mm-hmm. Madison's view was err on the side of separation because you run the risk of hurting religion if you don't. And I think my main challenge to the religious right and to religious conservatives in general is to tap back into that viewpoint that I think really has been lost. Of like, okay, I agree that you have the right to have more church-state mingling than maybe the ACLU says. But is it really good for Christianity? Is it really good for religion to have this happen? And I feel like they would benefit from listening to the voices of their 18th century forefathers about what happens to religious vibrancy when you feel like it's so important to have the government stamp of approval. And you're right, no one ever comes out and says they want, state control of things, but they do want they think it's very important that you be able to have prayer in school and at graduations and at City Hall, and that you be able to have in official public places religious values expressed. And I question why that's so important to them. Why do they think that really advances their religious life? And I would encourage them to be more aware of the potential risks to religion of doing that.
Yeah, I share a lot of that. I'm curious though. Would you oppose grants to students who attend Notre Dame or Yeshiva College or SMU on the grounds that this is an intermingling of religion and state? Clearly it is. The government's giving grants and people are going to explicitly religious institutions or money going to religious hospitals. Is that in principle a problem for you? And if it's not, why would you support that as opposed to some of the other things?
Well, I tend to think that if you have government support that benefits religious institutions as a secondary factor, and that if it's open to everyone, if they had a program that said you can only have Pell Grants if you go to a Catholic school, that I wouldn't support. But the way the government programs are set up is particularly, that's a really good example, I think, of a faith-based program that works very well because it is entirely neutral. The part of the program, as you know, that gives the money, and the part of the program that decides what religious institution there is, that's choices made by the student. So there's really a nice separation between the government writing the check and any religious decision making. So I actually always argued that was the best model. And even when it came to the faith-based initiative, I was kind of an advocate that a really good way of funneling faith-based money would be actually through national service programs. For the same reason, you give it to the person, have them choose, based on their own views, and then it makes it indirect. And then there's no question that the government is favoring one religion over another.
Yeah, I think that's a sound argument. Of course, that argues for school choice for elementary and secondary students. It's interesting. When I worked in the Department of Education when Bill Bennett was Secretary of Education, and I saw he blurbed your book. That was one of the debates, and it still is a debate today, that people on the left oppose school choice in part because they use the argument of in church and state, but they normally don't apply it to higher education.
Well, yeah, and I know people have made the distinction that, higher education, people in college, they are more responsible for making choices, and elementary school is you have more concern about coercion and all that. I don't know. I wanted to ask you a question on this, because one thing that's sort of been puzzling me a little bit about the school choice issue is, if you start out with the premise, the fair way of doing it, as you said, is you have it be, whether it's school choice, say, that it's open to everyone, and all sorts of different kinds of schools. So if kids want to go to a madrassa or a Muslim school or something like that, that would have to be part of the deal. First of all, how do you feel about that? Secondly, though, you do have this issue that even if you set up fair rules, and it's applied even-handedly, if you're giving government money out to anyone, you do have to regulate it. You have to find out where the money went. That's just, it's good stewardship of the money. So what worries me is not so much the church-state issues on the front end of it, of kind of making the decision, but what happens that the government has to go in and regulate it. And I'm concerned that when the government goes in and regulates it, that's when you're going to start to have infringements on religious freedom.
Yeah, and there's some schools that actually don't take government grants. colleges and universities, precisely for that reason. It strikes me that in general we found the right balance in higher education, because the same issues are and arguments are at play, which is, if you gave the money to a student, could they go to madrassas or some kind of, I think years ago there was a debate in California about witches, covens and so forth. And it's a trade-off. You can say, look, there are minimal standards that we have, like we have minimal standards in all sorts of areas of life, or you can allow institutions that don't want to be subject to those regulations to opt out, and then it's a balance wheel, which is weighing the good that can be done against the harm that can be done. And my suspicion on school choice, particularly if you targeted it for lower income kids, ones that are in the worst schools in America, that it'd be a great good. It's one of the great, I think, probably humanitarian undertakings that the government could undertake. And
do you think that
yeah, go ahead.
Well, do you think that the political support on the right would dry up for vouchers if money ended up going to Muslim schools?
I think it would depend on how much. I mean, again, I guess I'd use higher education as a model there. I don't. I think that you could use that kind of template to try and keep that from happening, and then it would depend on how many. That actually, there's some amount of evidence that there's opposition to school choice, not just from conservatives, but across the board, because a lot of people are worried. They're nice middle or upper middle class schools, but they're worried that kids from the inner city might come in. And that's too bad. I think that's a more practical concern and a troubling one. But I remember Bill Bennett saying that if you saw some of the schools that were in Chicago and Detroit, it would be hard to come up with schools, even if you design them, that could do worse for the kids. So I'm in favor of letting 1,000 flowers bloom, trying different ways, open to some amount of regulation, with the awareness that the regulations can become onerous. But as I say, there's public money goes to religious hospitals, and it goes to universities that are religious in nature, and we seem to have struck a pretty good balance on that. It's interesting when you talk about the effects, and this is what the early evangelicals, why they opposed having the state get involved with the church, and it really is something that echoes my own views, which is the effect that it has on the church. And that when you begin to play to that kind of an audience, that can be problematic. And there's also the fact that, and this is related, but not exactly on the same topic, but one that I've thought a lot about, which is when you get religion and politics and government so intertwined. Can also have a bad effect just on the witness of people who are people of faith. And in my case, as a Christian, I've seen it over the years, which is the seduction of power, and it's real. It's very easy for people who want to get involved in politics. They're motivated by admirable reasons and issues that they have deep principles on. But the more that you get involved with it, the more you have to make compromises. That's the nature of political power. And it's not only the compromises on the principles, but it's also the effect of religion and politics that it can have on one's spirit. I mean, I struggled with this when I was in the White House, and you work for a person that you believe in and that you're loyal to, and feel like that that person is on the receiving end of unfair attacks, pernicious attacks, and you want to respond. And how do you respond in a way that's loyal to the person you work for, because you genuinely believe and are upset by those charges, but that your own spirit doesn't get corrupted in the process, and it's not an easy thing to navigate.
Did you see, either inside the White House or just from dealing with the outside groups, other examples of this problem of the kind of engagement in politics affecting people's witness? Yeah,
I did, both before I was in the White House and while I was there. Chuck Colson has written very good stuff on this, and he wrote in the early 1980s, I think, that the easiest people to buy off when he was in the White House, and he wasn't a Christian at that time, were Christians and evangelicals. Essentially, all you had to do was give them a photo op with the president, and you had their support. And Malcolm Gladwell, I knew Malcolm Gladwell before it was cool. He actually worked here at Ethics and Public Policy Center in the 1980s, and he did a book review in the American Spectator, I think, on Jerry Falwell's book. And this was more than 20 years ago, so my memory is vague on it. But he used a fairly vivid imagery where he talked about Christians who talk so much about being in the world but not being of the world. And he said, but the reality is, for lots of them, they're like kids with their face pressed against the window on a candy store or a toy store, just longing to get in. And as I remember it, Falwell's book had a lot of name dropping with Menachem Begin and so forth, and that's what Malcolm was picking up on. And I know that even in the debate within religious community about religious freedom around the world, there are some extremely heated, attacks that go on, and there's a personalization of policy differences that one would think among religious believers you would see less of it. Sometimes you do, but it's not uncommon that you see more of it. And I don't know quite why that's there. I understand in general why it is, because if you're involved in politics, you're passionate about issues, and sometimes you get too angry, you get too juiced up, and you cross lines. But my sense was the alliance. Yeah, go ahead. Do you think that the alliance between religious conservatives and the Republican Party has been good for Christianity? That's a good question. I don't know that it's. My guess is it hasn't had a huge effect on Christianity. I would guess probably at the margins it's had some negative effects. I'd want to consider it more carefully than I have for a final verdict. But I remember a wife of a minister in New York coming down here at a meeting that I was a part of back in the 1990s. They had a church in New York City, and she talked about how difficult it was to get people in New York City to think about attending the church, because they so associated the church and evangelical Christianity with the agenda of the religious right. And for a lot of people, I mean, you've seen this, and I have too, which is there's a kind of almost reflexive effort sometimes, or reflexive reaction in which people think of faith and they think immediately of a political agenda. And that's really why I've got that concern and have written about it over the years, because religion ought to be transpolitical, it ought to be trans-ideological, it ought to stand in judgment of all political systems, and not wed to any of them. Now, having said all of that, and those are my fairly deep convictions on that issue. It does get complicated, because I think we would all come up with issues, moral issues, that we think that the church ultimately should weigh in on. I mean, in our own history, there was the abolitionist movement and the civil rights movement. That's somewhat different than your book, because yours really deals with the whole notion of the founding and and the government as an active agent on religious matters. But there was a use of religious language and even preaching politics from the pulpit, which in general I'm very nervous about. But it was done, and it was done because there was a moral issue that was pressing at the time. And I think probably most people look back at it and say, I'm glad we did, and I'm glad Martin Luther King was who he was, that he was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. I don't know, does that make...
Yeah, I know it was there was a really interesting disagreement between Jefferson and Madison on the one hand and Adams and Washington on the other. Washington, he used more... the amount of religious rhetoric he used makes George Bush look like he's an ACLU board member. I mean, he was, as head of the Continental Army, he would routinely have calls for prayer, and he attributed victories to divine intervention. And then as president, he had serious prayer proclamations around Thanksgiving and other times, and then John Adams did as well. Then Jefferson gets into office, and he makes a big point of discontinuing that practice. Mm-hmm. And the Danbury letter, which gave us the famous wall between separation of church and state phrase, was originally intended as a letter from Jefferson explaining why he didn't do prayer proclamations anymore. Madison agreed with Jefferson, and he didn't do as many prayer proclamations, though even he ended up a little bit. And the most interesting explanation came from Madison, which is really very simple. It was just that if a politician issues a prayer, the prayer will be viewed as political.
Yeah.
And what does that mean to dilute prayer? And in a way, it's almost like religious conservatives, and I think religious liberals as well on different issues, have always had the hope that bringing religion into the public square will lift up politics. But just as often, politics drags down religion. And I agree, the examples you gave are great ones of the ennobling aspects of religion in the public square and in social movements. Then there are the other examples. And there's this book, I think, called Unchristian. I don't know if you've read that, but it's from the Barna group. People and they concluded that among young people, young Christians, that the political connection between evangelicalism and essentially Republican Party politics had a negative effect on the public perception of Christianity among young people, among young Christians. And it's very interesting. I mean, I sort of assume that that's part of why you're seeing this evangelical kind of rethinking of the church-state role.
Yeah. My suspicion, and I want to read the literature on it, and there are people that have covered this much more than I have. I think a large part of it, not all of it, but a large part of it has to do with the tonal aspects of the debate. It gets complicated. I mean, I don't have a problem, and I suspect you don't either, which is people who are religious want to get involved in politics because they want to advance certain agendas. Now, that may be the pro-life agenda, it may be trying to end genocide in Darfur, and it may be any of a number of other issues. And I suspect that if the way that we dealt with those people and those issues, and the people in politics on the one hand and people of faith on the other, if the tone was different, that is, less jagged-edged, less a sense of kind of judgmentalism, and more of a redemptive message and a message of social justice.
More Christian in tone, in effect.
Yeah, I think.
In the broadest sense.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that, and that gets back to what we were talking about earlier, which is just very easy to have one's spirit kind of corrupted, and I think there's probably a tropism here that people who have strong views and speak out very loudly and are aggressive and a certain type of personality is drawn into politics. But my sense in talking to a lot of evangelicals is that what bothers them is the tonal aspect and a certain kind of what they view as an unsophisticated and black and white theology. And of course, when you have voting pamphlets or voting issues that were sent out years ago. Clearly, the New Testament or the Old Testament has very little to say about capital gains tax cut or most of the issues that would appear. What they were really pushing for was a conservative agenda, which is a perfectly legitimate agenda, and I'm conservative. But I think the problem was when you take what is a political and philosophical agenda and put it under the banner of faith and say now, this is the way that Christians ought to act and be. That's the problem. Now, I will say, having said that about the religious right, that there's also a problem, in my judgment, on the religious left. And I saw Jim Wallace blurbed your book, but Jim Wallace, I think, is equally at fault here. And he has said some things and written some things that I think were extremely problematic, both tonally and substantively. And not long ago, he had a blog in reaction to a 60 Minutes piece where he said Dick Cheney is a liar and Don Rumsfeld is a liar, and that they really ought to be up on charges of war crime and corruption, and if found guilty should spend the rest of their lives in jail. And that kind of stuff isn't helpful either. And Wallace tends to frame things in, I think, much of the same way as the religious right, but from a religious left perspective, which is, if you are a person of faith, you're going to have a certain view of compassion. That's going to translate to a certain view of government programs and budgets or moral documents, and I think that's a problem too. But one that's less commented upon than the religious right.
Well, so what's wrong with that on both sides? I mean, because as you said, if you're a religious leader or someone who's coming at something from a faith perspective, you're going to see something with moral clarity, and we might not agree with whatever the moral clarity is, but it's clear and dramatic. And so, what's wrong with them inserting that into the dialogue that way? It's unpersuasive, I suppose, is one part of it, because if people don't share your vocabulary, they're left cold.
I think there are a couple of things that are problematic. One is that a lot of times, just strictly in terms of the quality of the arguments and the empirical judgments, they're just flat wrong. A lot of times there are things said that are just reckless and don't withstand scrutiny. So I think that's problematic. I'm very wary of the notion of saying if you are a good Christian or whatever, choose the faith that you want, you're going to come down on X issue. Now, I understand that there are, issues that one could make that argument because it's so morally compelling and maybe so morally obvious. But I think it's a very, very high bar. Now, people don't usually make it that explicit, but that is really what is driving it. And so if you're talking about a budget as a moral document, and you can see that the framing of the issue is that if you're a person of faith that takes seriously the commands to care for the poor, then you're going to support a federal budget that increases spending on X issue by Y percent. And I just think that's problematic in the extreme. And as I say, I could come up with issues where I suppose I would say that it would be obvious, but I think it's a dangerous thing.
Didn't the Republican Party and the White House to some degree encourage the idea during the campaigns that you couldn't really be a good Christian if you were a Democrat? No. You can examine the statements that the president made, and you have to show me the specifics, but there's nothing that comes to mind that happened. You can certainly. I wouldn't suggest. I definitely wasn't suggesting that Bush himself did that, but I used to hear this all the time from people who were Democrats in Republican congregations that were told that people were surprised if they heard they were Democrats, and basically said, "How can you call yourself a Christian?" And the I don't remember. There was the leaflet that went out, and I guess it was Kentucky or West Virginia from the Republican Party saying the Democrats want to ban the Bible. and things like that. It seems like that did kind of, that message did get out there, no?
Well, I mean, if there was I don't know about the leaflet in Kentucky, if that's what it said, and there were no grounds for it, and I assume there were no grounds for it, then I'd obviously object to it. I just have to know what they meant by ban the Bible. I suspect what goes on, and this is an issue that probably is more of an issue with Catholic Church than Protestant denominations, of which I'm a part of, is that the Church has spoken out on the issue of abortion and said that if you are a faithful Catholic, you can't support or shouldn't support abortion, and I suspect more broadly what happens is that people make arguments that are moral arguments that are driven and animated by their faith, which happens to a lot of us. So when you're making the argument that this is an issue that has moral ramifications, and the morally right position is this, and the morally wrong position is that, and you're on the other side of the issue, what you hear, the way that's interpreted, is to say, well, what you're saying is I'm not a good person of faith, I'm not a good Christian, I'm not a good Muslim, I'm not a good Jew, or so forth. So I suspect some of that goes on, but it doesn't strike me that the Republican Party has done this any more than the Democratic Party, and neither party should do it. If there's an effort to say, you're not a good Christian because of a position that you have in politics, I just think that at the end of the day, that's a bad tack to take. That doesn't mean that.
So, what kind of reaction? Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask if you have made that argument to James Dobson or the Family Research Council. Have you made that argument to them, and what kind of reaction did you get?
I haven't made it to them specifically because I've never talked to James Dobson and don't know him. I wrote a couple of pieces in the Washington Post in the 1990s where I made that argument. I think in some book reviews that I did, and in some subsequent writings since I left government. I didn't obviously make that argument while I was in government. I actually, my memory is from the ones that I wrote in the 90s. I got a fair amount of people actually who agreed with it. They felt like it gave voice to their views, including people who were conservative. But do you think the media gives? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Do you think the media gives too much attention to the advocacy groups like Family Research Council that push that argument, or because I think if you said you got a lot of reaction supporting that view from conservatives, but I suspect those aren't the voices you tend to see, on Crossfire. You tend to see Family Research Council and Dobson and those folks. Yeah, no, I didn't hear from them. Most of the people that I heard from were people who were not affiliated with it. And I'd want to be fair to the Family Research Council and to Dobson. Dobson, I have some issues on the tonal side with, but I just would want to be very careful to see, and I'm not saying that it hasn't happened, but I would want to see specifically what was said and whether in making their arguments that they crossed the line, which is, if you're a good Christian in this case, you would believe X or Y. My sense of most of what they do is that they are advocates for the family, which is a perfectly legitimate and even laudable position to take. And they put out research and make public arguments and try and rally people who share their views and make an argument as to why these issues ought to concern people. But these are really facts and circumstances because there are a lot of times lines that are fuzzy and ambiguous, and you get close to them, and sometimes you draw back from them, and sometimes you go over them. So before making a kind of sweeping statement against them, I'd want to see what they had to say. As I say, I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but I don't want to get out the branding iron too much.
What do you? This is changing topics a little bit, but I've been getting curious recently. Do you think that Barack Obama could make headway in the evangelical vote?
I thought he could. I certainly thought he had more potential than Hillary Clinton did in that respect, and I think he's quite fluent in speaking the language of faith, and in some ways quite compelling, and much more fluent than John McCain, for example, who I think by predilection and upbringing is not as much at ease in talking about his faith. So I thought that Obama had some real possibilities in that regard. But I think that there are a couple of issues that are going to be very problematic for him. One is his stand on abortion and Supreme Court appointments, because the whole issue of a culture of life is still probably the most important and animating issue for evangelical Christians. It's not the only one, and the agenda is broadening. There's more concern for social justice and less narrowly confined to abortion and the family. But those issues are still important. And, Obama voted against Justice Roberts and Justice Alito, which I think is an indefensible argument for him to make, particularly as he's trying to position himself as a kind of post-partisan unifier. And they were exceptionally well qualified. Secondly, I think the Reverend Wright issue was really hurt him. I went in as a person who admired Obama, and actually wrote a piece in the Post that praised him in many respects. But the Wright thing really bothered me. I was actually called some out early on of cognitive dissonance, because I thought, how can this person who's so appealing and has such a compelling message about unity, overcoming racial divides, and his whole temperament and countenance, how could a person like that be at that church for 20 years? And I haven't been persuaded by the answers he's given, and I think that whole issue of his association with Wright probably is going to be problematic for him. The last thing I'd say is Hillary Clinton was just killing Obama on the Catholic vote. In many states, like Ohio and Pennsylvania, I think I'd have to go back and read the data, but she was carrying Catholic vote by 70%. Now, that's different than evangelical vote, but that was fairly striking to me. So, bottom line is, I think Obama had some potential. He might be able to reclaim it. Certainly got the skills to do it, but I think his positions and his associations have undercut him a lot. What about you?
By the way, the exit polls from North Carolina and Indiana had Obama significantly closing the gap on the Catholic vote compared to what he had in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure why exactly, but he actually almost broke even in North Carolina and cut the gap, I think, in half compared to Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and
I haven't really seen a good explanation of why.
And I would too. I wonder if that's a trend, whether that's based on an argument he made or something else. And if that doesn't change, that's going to be a problem for him in November. I think it's very much a Democratic year for the most part. All the metrics favor the Democrats, but some of the demographic problems that Obama has, including with religious voters and Catholics, could be a problem if it continues. And I noticed the same thing. What about you? What do you think of Obama as it relates to evangelicals and people of faith generally?
Well, before the Jeremiah Wright thing, I thought Obama could really make tremendous headway into the evangelical community, despite his positions on abortion, which I think will still be a problem. But his temperament, the way he speaks about faith, the way he speaks about evangelicals, his whole style, and also a friend of mine who's an evangelical writer made a really interesting point to me, which was that in the evangelical community, the black church is in some ways viewed very positively as real religion in a way that Methodism and Episcopalianism with John McCain isn't.
Right.
So I think, you combine all that, I think he had a real chance. The Reverend Wright thing, that I think that probably permanently cost him some of it. But when you look back at Democratic Party politics, Bill Clinton won 32% of the white evangelicals. John Kerry won 22% of the white evangelicals. So I suspect that Obama, at a minimum, could get it back up to the Clinton level, to 33%, and that could be a very significant. Development. I think the missing piece. Part of the reason why I think this works, and tell me if you think I'm wrong about this, because you're much closer to it than I. But by the second term of the Bush presidency, I'd seen enough of these kind of faith bio DVDs about him. I can't remember. There was one particular that was given out a lot during the 2004 campaign. It was an hour-long thing about the faith of George Bush that was distributed in churches. The thing that struck me about it is that it almost never mentioned abortion, or gay rights for that matter. It was all about his faith journey. It was all about him as a person who, struggled with drinking and was kind of ne'er-do-well, and then he got faith and he got his act together. And so in that sense, I think Obama's faith journey is probably I thought that's the most important thing of all, and that could end up trumping his actual positions on abortion. But the Reverend Wright thing is a big deal, and I suspect that he still could do much better than Kerry did. Maybe that's not saying much, but probably lost some real opportunity. And I was wondering, on the McCain side, one of the peculiar things about the Republican primaries is McCain was cast as this candidate who was kind of not in sync with evangelicals, and certainly the evangelical leadership just hates him. And yet he actually did pretty well among evangelical voters. He did not tank among evangelical voters. And I wonder, do you have any theories on why there was such a gap between what evangelical leaders thought of McCain and evangelical voters thought of McCain?
Yeah, it's a good question. For one thing, I don't think that the evangelical voters are, what was the old Washington Post, poor, uneducated, and easily led. I think that the hold that evangelical leaders and parachurch leaders and people involved in politics have on people of faith has always been a bit more tenuous than folks think, and it's less so now than even in the past. So I think that that's one thing. The second thing is that there's probably McCain's life, particularly the prisoner of war side, the palpable sense of honor and patriotism, love of country that he has, I think, appeals to them like it appeals to lots of people. So I suspect that is a factor as well. And thirdly, McCain's voting record on issues that are important to a lot of evangelicals is pretty good. What's I think has happened is that McCain's voting record is good, but he doesn't put a lot of energy on behalf of those issues. He votes the right way, but he's not a particular advocate, and he certainly is not comfortable in giving voice or making pro-life argument. I think that's
so. Why did the evangelical? I can understand why the evangelical leaders never really. He wasn't their candidate, but I've never totally fully understood the hatred that you saw with them. And when I would ask, it would always be things like campaign finance reform, which I understand the disagreement there, but there was always something disproportionate, the level of passion.
Right.
And maybe it goes back to when he called Falwell and Robertson agents of intolerance. Maybe they just, maybe that's just too much to get over. But do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean. I think that's part of it. I think that speech that he gave in Virginia, even people who are not necessarily fans of Falwell and Robertson, felt like he was going a bit too far.
It was tough.
A lot of people had that, and he was angry at the time, and he probably should have been surrounded by aides who said you may want to hold off here for a second. I think the other thing that is the case with McCain, and this goes beyond evangelicals, the conservative community in general, is that there is a sense, whether it's legitimate or not, that he enjoyed sticking his finger in their eye, that he fell in love with his maverick image, and that he got a particular thrill out of standing up against certain conservative issues and the conservative movement, and in some ways identified himself apart from it. The thing that you hear, and I don't think this is fully true, but I think there's some element to it, which is that he played to the New York Times, he played to a kind of different audience, and they didn't, conservatives, and I think this probably goes for some conservative evangelicals, didn't feel like he was an extremely reliable ally. Now, on abortion, which is again the issue that is dominant with many voters. He has been dominant, but he hasn't been a leader on the issue. But it is a curious thing. There's no question that among some group of people, including some of the religious, Jim Dobson, as you know better than I, because you follow this closer than I do. But I think Dobson at one point said he would never vote for McCain. Now I think he's kind of backed off from that position. Now, given the choice just on the policy issues, that's a hard position to justify for Dobson, and I suspect it's why he pulled back. But my suspicion is that it was driven by a kind of personal animus, and I'm really not sure, other than what I've just said, what was driving that.
It's always I always found it amusing when McCain makes his occasional efforts to appeal to religious right. And we had an interview with him on Beliefnet, and we asked him, do you think that the Constitution created a Christian nation? And he said yes. He did think the Constitution created a Christian nation. And I've sort of felt he doesn't have the pandering thing down yet, because, there's ways of answering that question that you could say it's a Christian nation, or it's Christian population, or it's Christian nation because it has Judeo-Christian values. There's lots of ways you can finesse that, where you sort of appeal to the Christian community without saying something that's technically wrong.
Yeah.
But to say the Constitution envisions a Christian nation, I think that's a tough thing to prove.
Yeah, I think it's an impossible thing to prove. It's fine to say that it presupposes a religious and moral people, but that's quite different than saying it's a religious nature. And this gets back to what we both were saying, which is that Obama is on the issue of faith is more conversant. And I also agree with what you said about George W. Bush, and I think that explains part of what happened in 2004 and why Obama could potentially do better among evangelicals. I think both he is much more effective than John Kerry ever would be, and also that George W. Bush had a relationship with Christian conservatives that's much deeper than John McCain, precisely because of Bush's faith journey, and it's real, and there was a kind of comfort zone that people had who were religious, that when he spoke, it struck them as authentic, and it was something that they identified with. And that's true of most of us in politics. It's not the ultimate reason or the chief reason that you vote for somebody, but running for president is a highly personal decision, more than most other political offices, and there's something to the fact that you want to feel comfortable with somebody, and that you feel like you might understand the order of their lives. And so I think the relationship that Bush had with evangelicals was probably as strong as any president had. As strong, I would suspect, maybe stronger even than Reagan did. Now, that has weakened over time because of the Iraq War and other things. But at its high water mark during the first term in the re-election, it was really quite strong.
And I wonder what if you look at the polling data about evangelical approval rating of President Bush, it sort of tracked the population as a whole, though it was always higher than the norm. And then as the approval rating nationally went down, it went down also. With one exception, which is really interesting, is that young evangelicals started out even higher. They loved Bush. Whatever the approval rate was nationally, young evangelicals was another 5 or 10% higher. And then when it crashed, they went 5 or 10% lower than the average. It was like there's a real sort of more profound disillusionment. Now, I don't know whether it's going to last,
Oh, I'm sorry.
another month.
They became more disillusioned.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I see.
They started off even more excited, and then when the disillusionment sank in that a lot of people had, they became even more disillusioned than the norm.
I see. I'm sorry. I misheard you. I thought you said first that they stayed more supportive. That is interesting. And would be worth finding out what the reasons for that were. Maybe.
Hey, do you think? Probably is. I mean, I wonder, when you look at how religion is talked about in the campaigns. As I was going through this book, The Founding Faith, that and looking back at some of the writings that the founders wrote about their religious beliefs, I kept thinking, could this guy get elected now? So particularly Jefferson, my guy. If you look at what he wrote about religion and how the Bible is full of dung. And they're all Apostle Paul and Calvin Luther are charlatans and wicked. I mean, and not to mention the fact that he actually sat there in the White House with the scissors cutting up the Bible, taking out the parts he liked and pasting it in to a new volume. I keep, imagining in my head the campaign commercial. The attack ad on Thomas Jefferson. Here's what Thomas Jefferson thinks of the Bible. Yes. Snip, snip, snip.
Why didn't that cost him more than it did?
He kept it secret. I mean, at least the part about cutting up the Bible, he kept very secret, and to the point where he had actually shown someone a syllabus. And when the guy died, he went to the trouble of writing to the family, asking them to give it back because he was afraid he was going to get out.
Okay.
And it was only his family knew about it. And despite that, only a fraction of what he wrote about religion was really known at the time. But what was known did get him in trouble, and they did try to use it in the 1800 election. They said he was an infidel, and if you, it would be an insult to God to vote for Jefferson. That's a tough campaign slogan.
Yeah. It's interesting. People talk about how negative politics is today and how polarized we are. But as you know, if you go back to the election of 1800, this is kid stuff compared to what it was. And interesting. Probably my greatest role models and heroes in politics have been fairly polarizing figures. So I don't take polarization by itself as a negative. It depends on polarization for what ends, and who you are that you're offending. But I suspect if Jefferson's theology and his editing skills were widely known back then, it would have cost him. If those same things were done today and it was known, there would be a price to it. I can promise you that.
Yeah. Now you had said in your email that I think James Madison is your favorite founder.
Yeah, he's way up there. I mean, partly for the reasons that you wrote about, and I think that his work on the Constitutional Convention, he was the best prepared, I think, of all the founders, which is saying something. He was so well read and so thoughtful, and was really, I think, a genius at writing and his role in the Constitution, and that it's endured so well. And there's something kind of attractive about him, this kind of slight, small figure, never traveled outside of America, compared to, the swashbuckling Jefferson, and I think he was a great counterweight to Jefferson, and so the quality of his mind and his role in American history, I think is how measured he was, and how well educated he was. I've always had a fondness for him, and he is strangely unhonored in this city. There are very few tributes to Madison. What about you? I gather, at least for the purposes of this book, he was the star. I think you say somewhere in here. You write
Yeah.
the greatest thanks is owed to Madison at the end of the book.
Yeah, I come around to really he's sort of the hero of the book, and personally, you sort of imagine Jefferson's the guy who gets the girl. He's glamorous, and he did the shrewd thing of putting religious freedom on his tombstone, which is the ultimate in clever spin. Put it on your tombstone. But it was actually even that the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which Jefferson wrote, it died in committee when he submitted. Then he went off to France, and while he was in France, Madison resurrected it and got it through. So Madison was like this zealot-like figure who kept popping up at the key moments of religious freedom battles and really pushing it through. But here, I'll tell you something that'll depress you as a Madison fan. I was down with my family at Disney World a month or two ago, and I don't know if you've ever been, but they have this Hall of the Presidents exhibit where these animatronic Chester Arthur and Rutherford B. Hayes, wiggle their toes and scratch their whiskers. And before you go in, there's like a holding room while you're waiting. And they had portraits of all the presidents, or the big presidents. And there on the wall was was Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Monroe. They just skipped right past Madison. They didn't even exist. Boy, this guy, what's a guy got to do to get his proper honor at Disney World?
Yeah, no, that's exactly true. Though it's one of those curious things where his presidency, of course, was not nearly as effective as his role in the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention, which probably goes to show that different talents and different skills manifest themselves in different ways. And Jefferson got the Louisiana Purchase, and Madison didn't.
You and I can, we'll once a year, we'll have to hoist. No, I guess it wouldn't be a drink because he was sort of a teetotaler. He was a little bit boring that way, but we'll have to celebrate James Madison's birthday when everyone else is ignoring it.
A cup of tea for Madison, fair enough. Well, it's been a great conversation, and it's a terrific book, Stephen. And
thank you. I appreciate
it's actually an authentic contribution, which is rare. So nicely done.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.